For 20 years, one label ruled the planet. Made in China. Your iPhone, your Nike shoes, your clothes, everything, almost all came from the same place. By 2023, China made 1/3 of all the manufactured goods in the whole world. Not just that, it produced more than 75% of the EV batteries for the world. China mined more than 70% of the world's mineral, gold, silver, zinc, magnesium, tungsten, you name it. But then, something happened a few years ago that shifted the whole global dynamic. Major companies like Apple, Samsung, Google pulled their investment out of China. Unemployment rose to 17%, and during the same time, India started roaring with development. Our exports surged to $800 billion. We attracted $80 billion in investment and all the major companies setting up factories in India. We are witnessing a global power starting to shift from China to India, and most people have no idea it's happening. So in the next 15 minutes, I will show you how exactly China went from the world's factory to a country investors are running away from, how India is slowly taking over to become the world's new manufacturing hub, and why this shift will change everything about how we live, how we work, and how we buy stuff. Around the 1980s, India and China were very similar economies. In fact, China was poorer than India. They had seen one of the most dangerous famines in history. More than 30 million people died of hunger. China's per capita GDP was lower than India. Its exports were negligible and foreign companies were non-existent as it was a closed economy. But that decade marked a turning point when Deng Xiaoping came to power. He visited the US and Singapore in 1978, and he saw what foreign capital and industrial policy could really do. And he changed China's course. The new Chinese government introduced special economic zones where taxes were lower, land was easier to acquire, labor was cheap, and the law offered protection that foreign companies couldn't find elsewhere in Asia. And then Western businesses didn't hesitate. They came in waves. First, there was Coca-Cola, then IBM, then Motorola, and the rest followed. By the mid-90s, China's exports increased 14 times from about $10 billion to over $148 billion. By the early 2000s, it joined the World Trade Organization, which gave it access to global market at scale. At the same time, it was building hard infrastructure faster than any country in modern history. Between 1992 and 2010, China laid down more than 60,000 kilometers of expressways. The entire US interstate system took 4 decades to reach that mark. Next came the factories. Reliant laborers equipped with technology and processes to handle scale. Because the advantage wasn't just labor cost anymore, it was an end-to-end manufacturing system. Entire supply chains ready to be deployed all over the world. I mean, you could really build a phone, source its parts, print the packaging, and then ship it worldwide, all within a 100-kilometer radius. By 2010, China had pulled ahead so far it felt like it won the race. That year, it overtook the US as the world's largest manufacturing nation. It produced more steel than the next 10 countries combined. China controlled 97% of the global rare earth exports, and it began dominating upstream sectors that no one else paid attention to, like polysilicon for solar panels, cathode materials for EV batteries, and base chemicals for pharmaceuticals. China had become the factory of the world, not because it was the cheapest, but because it made production and scale look very easy. And for a while, it worked, until the cracks started to appear. By the mid-2010s, China was producing more than it could consume, especially in the real estate sector. As early as 2011, analysts estimated there were about 64 million empty properties and apartments in China. Entire housing complexes, malls were empty. Societies made to house millions barely occupied a few thousands. So the real estate market kept growing, but demand couldn't keep up. Developers borrowed heavily, betting on endless expansion, and for a while, the system absorbed it. The government pushed credit, built new infrastructure, and kept the machine running. But then came 2020.
COVID-19, coronavirus, COVID-19.
The number of cases of COVID-19 outside China has increased.
When COVID hit, China did what it was built to do. It acted fast, centrally, and aggressively. Entire cities were sealed off.
China has sealed off 2 cities.
Cities in China are on lockdown.
Millions were tested daily, whole industries paused overnight. For 3 years, China's zero COVID policy didn't just slow the economy, it introduced a new kind of instability.
If you slow China down, the world slows down.
Supply chain froze, exports stalled, demand collapsed, foreign executives couldn't enter the country, and of course, Chinese citizens couldn't leave the country. And for companies that has built the entire operation around predictability, this became a major red flag. China's GDP went down by 4 to 5% and the condition of the people went from bad to worse.
Only one person from each family will be allowed to go out once a day to purchase necessities.
The Zhengzhou Foxconn protest in the late 2022 wasn't an isolated event. The youth suicide rate had more than doubled between 2019 and 2021. Millions of migrant workers remained traumatized from living in dormitories or apartments without even kitchens, surviving on instant noodles for weeks and months at a time. More than 2 lakh tech jobs were eliminated just between July 2021 and March 2022. So the entire world was witnessing this. Global companies realized that they had a single point of failure. They were too dependent on just one country, and their biggest supplier could actually shut down overnight. In 2023, foreign direct investment into China turned negative for the first time in decades. More capital left the country than came in. Youth unemployment in urban centers passed 20%. Evergrande, one of the biggest real estate developers in the world, defaulted on over 300 billion in liabilities. Families were left with unfinished apartments they had already paid for. Construction sites stood frozen for months. Home ownership, which was once a symbol of stability, became a source of anxiety. Not just that, but demand for steel, EVs and solar panels dropped across key markets. And factories started producing below break-even just to stay open. And behind it all was a deeper structural problem: centralization. Over the last decade, more and more decision-making power has been taken by the government. Local governments and even large companies waited for top-down signals before acting. This was very strange because till now, the entire growth story of China had been around decentralization. And at the same time, geopolitical pressure began closing in. Trade tensions with the US escalated.
It's an absolute extreme disruption for the Chinese economy right now that's come because of repeated terrible behavior on their part.
Tariffs were imposed and West grew wary of over-dependency on China. So by 2024, one thing was very clear. China hadn't lost its dominance, but it has lost its stability and reliability. And that's when the search for an alternative truly began. Even long-standing partners started reassessing their exposure. Apple, Intel, Nike, Tesla all started to look for a China plus one solution. But when global brands started asking where to go next, the early answer wasn't obvious. Vietnam, Indonesia, Mexico all had potentials, but none of them could actually match the scale, the workforce, or geopolitical balance that India offered. But India wasn't always ready to take on this role. For years, it was held back by bureaucracy, fragmented regulation, and slow approvals. Setting up a factory in India meant dealing with dozens of departments, each with its own paperwork and timelines. Land acquisition was a political minefield, infrastructure was unreliable, and most foreign manufacturers saw India as a consumer market, not a production hub. That perception started to shift in 2019. The government slashed corporate taxes to 22% for new manufacturing units. The rate dropped further to 17%, putting India among the most competitive tax destinations in Asia. Around the same time, India launched the Production-Linked Incentives (PLI) scheme. It was very simple. Hit your manufacturing targets and the government pays you cash incentives. It wasn't just about subsidies, it was about signaling intent. Big companies like Apple started to notice. By 2020, Apple began diversifying its assembly lines into Tamil Nadu and Karnataka. The early runs were small, lower tier models, limited production, but as systems stabilized, the scale grew. And by 2023, India was producing 1 out of every 7 iPhone. By mid-2025, that number was closer to 1 in 5 iPhones. Other companies followed. Samsung had already invested in Noida, building the world's largest mobile phone factory. Micron, a global leader in storage solution, began construction on a $2.75 billion semiconductor plant in Gujarat. Foxconn committed to manufacturing EV parts in Karnataka. Airbus partnered with Tata to build military aircraft in India, not assemble but manufacture end-to-end. This wasn't slow interest, it was supply chain repositioning. But India's movement isn't just about who's coming in, it is also about what we did internally to get here. We aren't just relying on companies to come, we are growing on our own. India now ranks 6th globally in terms of patent applications, signaling a surge in local R&D. India became the 3rd largest producer of pharmaceuticals by volume. India's digital payment systems, UPI, is functional in Singapore, France and UAE. And under it all, the biggest difference is the shift in demographics. India's median age is 28, China it is 39, and that gap is growing. And for manufacturers, it means more workers entering the system every year in India. And for brands, it means more consumers with rising incomes and global exposure. And workforce availability isn't just about volume, it's about adaptability. India's young labor force is digitally literate, English speaking of course, and increasingly mobile. That gives it an edge in the tech-led manufacturing. Think semiconductors, EV, clean energy, the sectors that are shaping the next wave of global industry. And to support that, the infrastructure is catching up too. Over 18,000 kilometers of highway, 100 smart cities, 2nd largest metro system in the world, fiber penetration has improved dramatically, and internet costs are among the lowest in the world. And most importantly, India offers something many countries can't. Stability. It maintains trade relationship across ideological lines. It sits with BRICS with China and Russia, and in the Quad with US, Japan and Australia, signaling good diplomatic relationship with every side. Also, when Russia invaded Ukraine, India didn't freeze. It brought oil from one side and sold arms to the other and kept diplomatic channels open. That doesn't make it neutral, it makes it dependable. In early 2025, tension escalated when Pakistani drones targeted Indian military installations in Jammu. But India didn't overreact. It stood firm, achieving a 100% defense rate, highest in the world, showcasing a robust defense system. The response was unanimously positive. Markets held steady. Foreign inflows didn't stall. Defense sector stocks rose 6% by the week's end. To investors, it was a proof that India could protect its borders without disrupting the economy. And by mid-2025, India had signed new defense exports deals with Vietnam, the UAE and Kenya. For investors and manufacturers, that distinction matters because when you're betting billions on supply chains, you're not just looking for the cheapest deal, you're looking for the most resilient one. And in 2025, India has started to look like the most resilient bet in the world. But there is one slight issue. China didn't win the last global manufacturing cycle by competing in the existing markets. It won by taking over industries before anyone else took them seriously. 15 years ago, solar panels were expensive, inefficient and niche. Western companies saw them as a green alternative, but China saw them as a strategic asset. It flooded the sectors with subsidies, absorbed early losses and built the entire upstream supply chain from polysilicon refining to panel assembly. Today, China controls 80% of the global solar manufacturing. It did the same with electric vehicles. While most countries debated emission standards, China locked in lithium sources, scaled battery factories and invested in local brands like BYD and NIO. And now those companies are pushing into global markets with pricing power West cannot match. China controls 75% of cobalt reserves, making it almost a monopoly in the sector. And that is the real lesson. Dominance doesn't come from winning existing races. It comes from identifying the next one and running it alone. So India has begun to absorb demand in sectors where China is retreating: electronics, pharmaceuticals, auto parts. But to lead, it needs to go one step further, to get ahead of the curve, not just follow it. And there are signs that it is trying. Green hydrogen is one of them. India has committed over $2 billion in incentives for production, electrolyzer manufacturing and R&D. The goal is to make hydrogen a viable alternative to fossil fuel in steel, shipping and heavy industry, not just for India, but for export. Another is pharmaceuticals. India already supplies over 20% of the world's generic drugs, and its pharmaceutical exports crossed $30 billion in financial year 2024-2025. The PLI scheme for pharma triggered over 200 approved projects aimed at building end-to-end capabilities. But pharma is just one part of the strategy. India is now positioning itself as a global healthcare destination. In 2024, the government launched the Heal in India initiative, a plan to turn India into the world's healthcare hub. It targets medical tourism, which brought in over 1.4 million foreign patients in 2023, generating an estimated $6 billion in revenue.
Heal in India इस दशक का बहुत बड़ा ब्रांड बन सकता है।
And then there's India's digital backbone. What began as Aadhaar and UPI has evolved into a public digital stack that includes eKYC, DigiLocker, and ONDC. And these aren't apps. They are infrastructure tools that enables private companies to build product faster, cheaper, and at population scale. No other country has built a digital public good at this level. That creates a new kind of leverage. India doesn't have to dominate hardware to shape global markets. It can export systems. Payment trails, digital IDs, government-grade tech stacks to countries that cannot build them from scratch. But in all this, timing is very important. The same supply chain that are leaving China are being absorbed by Vietnam, Mexico, and Eastern Europe. In fact, Europe and US are trying to be self-reliant for their production. So we need to act fast because India has the ingredients, that is the labor, the market size, geopolitical position, and a functioning democracy. What it needs now is focus. So every few decades, the world rewrites its economic map. After the World War II, it was the United States. Post-Cold War, China rose to claim the mantle. And now another shift is taking shape. Slower, more complex, but just as consequential. Not as a cheaper version of China, but as a different version of global manufacturing. One where democratic systems and competitive scale could coexist. India isn't asking for trust, it's starting to earn it. When border tensions flare, exports don't stop. When global markets panic, India's domestic demand holds. When developed economies crumble, India stands strong. And none of this means that India is guaranteed to win. It still faces uneven regulation, policy delays, and capacity gaps. But the direction is clear, the money is coming, and the infrastructure is catching up. India is at the center of the global shift. The world's next 1 trillion in manufacturing output has to go somewhere, right? And the country that absorbs the most of it will shape the future, not just of production, but of partnerships. And that's the real shift we are watching. A redistribution of trust. And India, for the first time in decades, is positioned to receive it.